I'm not gonna lie, I was a troubled kid, always picking fights with other boys, even though I was shorter and skinnier than all of them. But I guess that's just what happens when your parents are alcoholics. You get neglected and then you lash out. And I did lash out a lot. At 12, I could count on one hand the boys in town I hadn't been beaten by. And for some reason I was proud of that. But fighting is not the only thing I did to cope. No. We lived in rural Oregon, a magical place where you could sometimes walk for hours on roads or in the woods and not see a single soul, and I loved it. I loved to be alone in remote places and loved to wander around, and most of all, I loved to camp out in the open. It wasn't really camping in the traditional sense, if I'm being honest. I took a sleeping bag, water and snacks, and a lighter into the woods, made a fire, and slept looking at the stars or treetops. It was cool, but it wasn't a family vacation or anything like that, and if I ever tried to do it for more than one single night, my parents would remember I existed and go looking for me, which wasn't good at all. I guess that what I was trying to get to was that I was a bad kid, constantly running away, the son of the town's drunks and all that. So I guess I understand why they didn't believe me, why they thought I only wanted attention. It wasn't like that, not at all, but I get why they thought it was. It was July, and it was cold. Oregon gets really cold, and dying from exposure was a real risk that I never took seriously, especially in the summer. But that night, the cold was unbearable. It was abnormally cold, and I was forced to look for some sort of shelter in the middle of the night. I knew some places I could go to, and one or two old geezers who wouldn't mind finding me in their barn come morning, but I just didn't feel like bothering anyone that night, so I went looking for somewhere in the woods instead. Now, this was irresponsible, but not completely so. There were a few small caves, nothing too spectacular, big enough to get into and hang out, but not big enough to get lost in them, and the plan was basically to find one and sleep there. I thought it was going to be like prehistoric times, with me officially becoming a caveman, and it took me a while, but I found a cave. It was a big and cozy cave, not that warm, but I could start a fire there, which I did, and then the cold was gone, and I finally felt good and comfortable, enough to fall asleep at least. It didn't last. I must have slept for an hour at most. I was comfortable and warm, and then I felt my sleeping bag being tugged. I didn't react at first, thought it was a dream, but then it happened again, and I opened my eyes, and I just fucking screamed at the top of my lungs. A man was standing over me. He wasn't disheveled or anything like that. He was reasonably well dressed in jeans, a shirt, and a denim jacket. He wore glasses, and he had a clean-shaved face with a nice haircut. He wasn't scary. He shouldn't be, but he was. His eyes were like small black buttons looking at me. He had a smile that I'm sure would have been charming in any other setting, but at that moment just looked depraved. "Hello there," he spoke in this fake, cheerful voice. "What are you doing here all alone, young man?" He didn't sound natural. His voice and his mannerisms and the look on his face all looked and felt wrong. He looked like a shark or some other sort of predator sniffing his prey. He was trying to act as if he were worried and happy to have found me, and he wasn't good at it. "I'm not alone," I said instinctively. I didn't want him to know I didn't have anybody with me. At this point, I had already sat up, but still had the sleeping bag up to my waist, which I was using to my advantage by hiding my pocket knife under it. "Yes, you are." I felt myself getting cold all of a sudden. "No, I'm not. My father told me to get some sleep while he got more kindling for the bonfire. He'll be back any moment now." I tried bluffing, but by now I already knew something was about to go down. "Liar, liar, pants on fire," he said loudly while giggling. "I've been watching you. You're alone. I know you are," he said, with his voice getting lower as he went. I didn't think anymore by that point. Instincts kicked in, and I tried to get out of my sleeping bag to run, but he was faster and zipped me in it and then pulled me, grabbing my legs and dragging me deeper inside the cave, giggling like a schoolgirl as I shouted for help and tried to wiggle free from my bag. Thankfully, I had my knife. I stabbed twice from the inside, but it wouldn't tear, not until the third time when I hit the zipper. Only then did it not tear, but at least open pretty fast. He noticed, of course, but was confused enough by how I did it that I had a window to run for it. He still ran after me. He started screaming that he would get me, but he didn't really try. I think he realized that I wasn't worth the trouble and let me get away. I ran until I hit the road, and then kept running until I got home. It was intense, to say the least. I tried talking about him to my parents, and when they didn't believe me, I went to the cops. But nothing worked. Nobody believed me, and nobody cared. But they cared about poor Billy Perkins. Billy was abducted by a maroon Ford truck and never found again, with it happening maybe a week after I was attacked. No one saw the truck anymore, and they were never able to identify the driver. But I know who he was. I never forgot his face. It's a damn shame no one believed me. When I was 12 years old, my parents decided to take my siblings and me camping as an end-of-summer trip. While my siblings were excited about the trip, I was not. I'm pretty sure I cried when they told me where we were going, and my 2 older brothers made fun of me for being such a girl and acting like a brat over something as small as camping. And I'm not gonna lie, I did throw a huge fit for weeks leading up to it. I tried everything I could to stop us from going. From lying about not feeling well, to threatening to run away if they made me go to the middle of nowhere where I had to use the bathroom behind a tree. My parents never fell for it, if you're wondering. So, on the day of the trip, I tried one more time to get out of camping by telling my parents I hurt my ankle when I got out of bed wrong. My parents, of course, didn't believe me, and off to the middle of nowhere we went. When we got to our campsite, I felt a bit silly because it was very nice. To make sure the experience was fun, my parents made sure they brought plenty of snacks I loved, pillows for extra comfort, and they even bought me my very own pink tent that I could be in by myself since I was a big girl. And when my dad showed me the bucket I could use instead of squatting behind a tree, I started to feel guilty about how I acted. I mean, it was still camping, and I still had to shit in a bucket, but still, it wasn't the worst. And I got distracted by the pretty animals and flowers, which made me miss my TV a little less. When it came to going to bed, I climbed into my pink tent with a smile and turned on my little lamp so I wouldn't be afraid of the dark. I was sleeping when a sound woke me up. I remember opening my eyes, confused because I thought I had heard a clicking noise, but when I listened for the sound to happen again, it didn't come. I was closing my eyes to go back to bed when I saw a flash of light blink into my tent, and then the sound of a click again. My heart was beating hard against my chest, and I sat up quickly, seeing a dark shadow just outside of my tent. I couldn't make out much since it was so dark and my lamp wasn't super bright, but when the flash of light went off again, I saw him. An older man, around my dad's age, with something in his hands pointed at me. I screamed as loud as I could for my dad, and the man ran off. Too afraid to leave my tent, I kept screaming until my mother and father came to my tent and asked me what was wrong. I told them about the man, about the flash of light, but they didn't believe me at first. They thought I was making things up again because I wanted to go home early. I think it was my sobbing and the fact that my story never changed that made my dad believe me, or at least made him not leave me alone in my tent. My dad and mom let me sleep between them in their tent that night, but I didn't sleep, too afraid the man would come back. The next day, my father and mother told us we were cutting the trip short. My siblings were mad at me, but they didn't say anything to me as they helped my dad pack up camp. I walked toward my tent to pack the few things I brought when something behind my tent caught my attention. As I walked toward it, I felt my eyes well with tears and fear. I was frozen in place, unable to move, as I looked at the item on the floor. My father came to look for me at some point, asking why I hadn't packed my things yet when he looked at the area where I was staring at. My father, who never swore, cussed and picked me up, carrying me away from the item on the ground and into the car where my mother was organizing our supplies. My dad whispered to my mother something that had my mother grabbing me in her arms, her body shaking, and my dad left again, telling my brothers to stay with my mom and me. Eventually, my father came back with my personal belongings, but left my tent and the small things we hadn't packed yet. We left shortly after and have never been back camping, nor do we talk about what happened. The item that had my father spooked? It was a photo of me sleeping in my tent. This story happened around 12 years ago when I was only 16. Around that age, you could say that I had zero parental supervision. My mother just wasn't interested, and my dad knew my mom made the rules. That was just how it was with my family. Well, it led to me getting involved with the wrong group of friends. At 16, I was hanging out with people well into their 20s. Now that I'm older, I'm aware how dumb and creepy it actually is. Anyway, I was the type that I always wanted to fit in. I didn't like to show weakness against these older groups of peers. Well, one night the oldest girl in the group suggested we go camping at this spot she had found a few weeks earlier on a hike. Everyone was immediately on board, and I managed to tell my mom that I wasn't coming home that night and that I was going to a friend's house. Once that was handled, we went and pulled all the camping gear out of the basement. There were 4 of us, and we all rode together. What the girl failed to mention was that the place she had in mind was nearly 3 hours away, and it was already 6 p.m. Granted, everyone seemed to be annoyed at the omission, but being the youngest, I just shut up and dug my nose into a book that I brought along. After what felt like ages, we arrived at this desolate side road that had Spanish moss hanging from the weeping willows. It looked like something straight out of a movie. Pulling the car over, we grabbed the gear and followed her into the woods. The woods were overgrown and there seemed to be no actual trail. There were no houses nearby, and we hadn't seen a car for miles, which just added to the loneliness. The girl stopped, and we almost all fell over her. In front of us stood a clearing that had trees circling it. The grass was shorter there, and it looked like a better option than the nonsense we just walked through. Mind you, it was also nearly 9:45 p.m. Using a small Coleman lantern that we brought with us, we started setting up this giant 6-person tent we had decided to bring. Once that was up, we all pulled our sleeping bags inside and set up camping chairs all around the tent. One of the guys started a small fire, and by 10:15, we were good to go. The girl had brought alcohol along with her in a giant duffel bag that she kept clutched to her chest and abdomen. As we all sat around, the guy she was with suggested scary stories, which everyone jumped on board with. They claimed it was a rite of passage. Not much got under my skin, so I was fine with it, until the girl pulled a Ouija board out of her bag, along with a pendulum and multiple black candles with tiny little black holders. Had it been any other situation, they'd be adorable. As soon as I realized what was happening, I felt my entire body go cold. I wasn't a big believer, but I didn't want to know for sure. Everyone else had used the alcohol as liquid courage and was excited to see what would happen. I refused to put my fingers on the planchet. It was a nagging voice in my head saying, "Don't do it," and I didn't. Sure, they made fun of me for a while, but they wouldn't be laughing for very long. I sat stoically in one of the chairs and just watched from a distance as they set it up and all placed their fingers on it. The girl was the one who started speaking first and asked the usual question of, "Is anyone there?" And they all seemed to hold their breath for a response. 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and 4 minutes ticked by with no luck. She did it again. It was slight at first, but from what they said, the planchet twitched. All of them looked at each other, and I was even now staring at them. They all assumed one of the other members did it. As they were in the middle of their screaming match, the planchet started to move again. I couldn't make out everything, but it spelled H-A-H-A at the end. Confused, the others started to fire more questions at the board, but the movement was indicative of someone wanting to keep a conversation going. The answers were short and sweet. The girl who conjured this brilliant idea got it in her head that this wasn't real, and it was them playing a joke when she decided to verbally berate the board. Most of us just stared with our jaws on the ground. I tried to warn her that it's probably not the best idea to talk smack to potential spirits because of the multitude of ways it could go wrong, but she ignored me. She called the board stupid and weak and said whoever was talking was minuscule considering they could barely formulate a longer phrase. Throughout all of it, the board never spoke back, but within the next couple of minutes, it did something far, far worse. The girl continued to trash talk, and most of us had checked out mentally by then, but it got our attention when she froze mid-sentence and her expression changed. It went from having a good time and a bit tipsy to looking like she had seen the devil himself. Her eyes were the size of $50, and her bottom lip trembled. She looked like she was going to start crying. The guy she was with leaned over to try to see what was wrong, but she stared straight through him into the nothingness that was lurking in the forest. While his face was nearly right in front of hers, she let out a blood-curdling scream that sounded straight out of a Michael Myers flick. She proceeds to fling her head side to side in a panic, repeatedly saying that they were coming. They were watching. Trying to figure out what was wrong with this girl, everyone else seemed to get hit with the smell of sulfur. 2 of the others started gagging from it. Here it was. 3 of the 4 people out here were all losing their sanity. I stood up trying to figure out what was going on with all of them, considering I was the only one who seemed unscathed. Said boyfriend managed to squeak out that they needed to say goodbye on the board before anything else happened, and as soon as they touched the planchet, it set out rapidly spelling out R-U-N, R-U-N repeatedly. On the 3rd completion, the girl who was seeing things sprang to her feet and whispered that someone was there before completely turning into a track star. Instead of going towards the car, she ran further in the opposite direction. Her boyfriend took off, but the rest of us were still trying to figure out what to do. I was opting to stay there and wait, but from a distance, another scream sounded in the trees. Assuming someone was in danger, all of us set off. The only thing I had to defend myself with was pepper spray, but I wasn't going empty-handed. We ran through the dense branches, and as we came out onto what appeared on the other side, I saw the couple on the ground. He was holding onto her as she clutched her ankle. He pointed to a root that was in the ground but sticking up. We waited on her boyfriend to convince this hysterical woman to let him carry her back. To pass the time, I started just walking around aimlessly. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but when I took a step while staring at the shape of a building in the overgrowth, I too almost twisted an ankle when the earth suddenly dropped away. Stumbling back, I managed to catch myself. Using the small light we brought, I shined it in a semicircle around me, and that's when I realized the mistake that everyone else made that night. The dip in the earth? That was a grave depression. Several broken and decimated headstones were in mismatched heaps all around. I tried to tell myself that they were animals, but one look at the worn writing bore the inscription of a soldier dating back to the Civil War. Suddenly, I didn't want to be there anymore, and neither did anyone else. The only exception was I didn't feel threatened like the others. I was uncomfortable, but mainly at the thought of someone berating a dead person, not because I felt threatened. Everyone else felt like they were going to end up missing. It was so bad that when I suggested we leave and walk towards the way we came, everyone refused. They opted to walk straight and reckoned if there's a graveyard, then a road has to be somewhere close by. Thankfully, it was. Trekking our way out, as we grew nearer to the edge of the cemetery, we saw what appeared to be wooden steps that Mother Nature had started to reclaim. We practically sprinted down the steps and onto the road. It wasn't until I was at the bottom step that I saw a plaque covered with vines. It was a historical landmark plaque that claimed that the site was a cemetery from the 1800s. There was a city that used to be there, but when the Civil War happened, they torched the city and it never recovered. The only thing that's left of the city is that piece of land. Timidly, we walked the half-mile back down the road to where our car was. It's been years, and I don't know what happened to that girl. She stopped coming to parties and stopped really going anywhere. She never told any of us what happened to her that night. The only explanation that I can think of is I didn't touch the planchet, so its problem wasn't with me. Then again, I might never know. My parents got divorced last year. Growing up, I'd always been closer to my mom, so I didn't really see my dad very much after that. One day, he called me out of the blue and said that we were going on a camping trip like we used to do when I was a kid. He didn't even ask me if I wanted to go. He just said we were going. I'd never liked camping, but I figured that he just wanted to reconnect with me, so I said sure. That weekend, we ended up trekking deep into the woods and set up our tent just as the sun was setting. We made a campfire and roasted hot dogs, and honestly, it was pretty nice. I could tell that Dad was really happy to be spending time with me. Then, out of nowhere, a little girl wandered into the clearing. She looked about 6 years old. She had long blonde hair and was wearing a dirty pink dress. We said hello and asked her where her family was. Without saying anything, she sat on the ground and just stared at us through the fire. "Does she need help?" I whispered to my dad. The girl didn't look worried or lost or anything. Her face was blank. We kept asking her who she was and where she came from, but all she did was stare. Then she stood up and walked back into the woods. As soon as she stepped into the shadows, she stopped and turned back around. With one hand, she waved for us to follow her. Then she ran into the darkness. I turned to my dad. "What do we do?" He said that she might be in shock or something. She might be lost and need our help. He started to stand up, but I tried to stop him. "Don't," I said. He didn't listen. He said that she was just a little girl searching for her parents. He told me to wait here while he went to find her. I told him it was a really bad idea, but he refused to listen. I could tell that this wasn't just about the little girl. It was us, about how he felt like he'd failed as a parent. He said that he'd be back as soon as possible, so he left me there and ran after the girl. I waited for 5 minutes before I started to get worried. The fire was starting to die out, and the woods got really quiet. I couldn't hear my dad anywhere. I couldn't hear anything. After 10 minutes, I knew that I'd have to go after him. I was terrified, but I didn't have a choice. I grabbed my flashlight and started to look around. I got farther and farther from our campsite, but I couldn't see any sign of that girl or my father. Suddenly, I made it to a cliff overlooking a deep valley. If I had been walking any faster, I probably would have walked right over the edge. I looked down at the ground far below, trying to see if my dad had fallen down there. The bushes were pretty thick, so I wasn't sure, but I couldn't see him. I turned back around and walked back to our campsite. By then, my heart was pounding. I kept thinking about that little girl. There was something very wrong about her. Had she done something to my father? Was he gone forever? When I made it back to camp, my fears instantly subsided. My dad was back, sitting next to the fire. I asked him what happened. He smiled at me and said, "I think it's time to put out the fire. You can do that, right?" He'd completely ignored my question. Sure," I said. Still smiling, he stood up and walked into our tent. He zipped it shut and went to sleep. I looked all around the clearing for that little girl, but I didn't see her. Who was she? And why didn't my father just answer my question? It was all so strange. I grabbed a bottle of water and extinguished the fire. Everything got very dark. I realized that the sounds still hadn't returned. The woods were still too quiet. I ran back to the tent and climbed inside. Once I zipped it shut, I felt so much safer. As long as Dad and I were in here together, I'd be okay. I crawled into my sleeping bag and turned to see if my dad was still awake. He wasn't there. I was the only one in the tent. But that was impossible. I watched my dad crawl inside the tent. There was no other way out, so where had he gone? My heart raced. I knew that I should have gone back outside and looked for him again, but I couldn't. I was too afraid. So I just lay there in my sleeping bag, silently praying that he'd come back. He never did. By the time the sun came up, I hadn't slept at all. In the daylight, I was able to see a lot better. I looked all around the woods, but I never found my father. I left our tent and everything else where it was, and I walked all the way back to the ranger station and reported my father missing. The ranger was an old guy. He seemed really sympathetic. He called 3 of his men to form a search party while he waited with me at the station. He gave me some coffee and assured me that his men would do everything they could. We sat for a while, and then he asked, "Before your dad went missing, did you see anyone else in the woods? Did you see a girl in a pink dress?" I nodded. His expression instantly dropped. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I don't think we'll find your father." And they didn't. This wasn't the first time that someone had disappeared in this area. No one knows who that girl is or what she does with the people who follow her. All we know is that once you see her, you're gone forever.